Okay, go ahead and be seated. Mr. Bogan?
Thank you. Focusing your attention again on the search of the trucks on November 29th, 2012, you also investigated, searched the beds of the trucks. You spoke about that on direct as well, correct?
Yes, the truck beds were also photographed and examined for any items or possible body fluids of interest.
And I think you testified at least to one of the trucks. You saw some stains that you wanted to follow up with phenolphthalein.
I know, it's a tricky one. Correct. There were some discoloration that, to me, weren't indicative of the red-brown staining I typically observe for blood, but in the interest of being thorough and due diligence, because perhaps it was being masked by some other fluid, for example, I wanted to test it. Those results did not indicate the presence of blood.
And you investigate both trucks, the beds of both trucks. You even use phenolphthalein in at least one of the trucks, correct?
Yes.
And based upon yours and the two other agents' investigation of these two trucks, nothing of evidentiary value was found.
Correct. That was the ultimate final decision after both searches were completed.
Okay. Let's talk about DNA and mixtures, shall we?
Let's.
Okay. I want to get more to the kind of the macro process that you did a good job of describing on direct examination about how DNA analysis happens at CBI. And as I understand it, the first part of the process when you get a swab, a sample, something that you're going to see if there's DNA on it, is you perform the extraction, correct?
Yes, that is the first step.
Right. And I guess, generally speaking, this first part of the analysis is you get some stuff. You want to see if there's biological material on it, correct?
Yes. We don't necessarily know if something has human DNA on it or not until you test it. And so by extracting, like I mentioned, you're attempting to isolate and purify the DNA that may be present. And then the second step of quantitation, see, do you have human DNA? Sometimes you have a sample and no human DNA is detected. And so that's what's reported and that sample stops.
And you got a little bit ahead of me, but I'm going to roll with it. No, it's fine. So the first thing you do is, and you describe this, is you have chemicals that go into the cells and draw the DNA out of the nucleus, AKA extraction, correct?
Yes, they also break open the cells because the nucleus is actually where the DNA is present in the cell, and so it's protected in the nucleus. So you need to break open the cell wall of the DNA, or excuse me, of the cell, and then you need to break open that nucleus as well to free the DNA into solution to allow it to be purified so that other chemicals and possible impurities are removed from the sample. And ideally, what you're left with is purified DNA.
And extraction, you free the DNA from the nucleus of the cell, and then second step, as you described just now and on direct, is quantification, correct?
Yes.
And quantification is you take that material out of the cell and you see how much you got, right?
Correct.
And then after extraction, quantification, then amplification, which you described as, think of this as a genetic Xerox machine or something, right?
Yes, genetic Xeroxer or molecular Xeroxer. It's where you are targeting specific locations and making copies of those particular locations and only those locations. I don't need your whole genetic genome, it's too much. I'm just looking at these particular regions of interest for forensic DNA testing.
And then after extraction, quantification, amplification, then the Starmix program gets applied to it, safe to say.
There's one more step. Sorry.
Okay.
So the amplified product, you now have to find a way to visualize it. How do you see it? So this amplified product is run on an instrument called a genetic analyzer. Very clever and unique. And so this gives you the raw data, which we then put in a different software program. It's not Starmix. It's a software program that allows us to visualize that DNA profile. What DNA information has been detected at each region for each sample. This data is analyzed for true DNA versus artifacts because as part of the DNA amplification process, sometimes you have artifacts that are generated, either from amplification or on the genetic analyzer. They are somewhat common in that they're easy, some are easy to recognize and remove. So that way it doesn't complicate things more for what is true DNA versus non-true DNA. Once this analysis has been done, you've removed the non-human DNA artifacts if they are present. You assess the profile for suitability, such as is it a single source? Is it a mixture? If it's a mixture, how many contributors would this be? Once you've done all these pieces, then Starmix comes into play at the back end.
Right. Starmix comes into play after quantification, amplification, and purification. Just strike that. I don't want to dive too deep there. But as you said, Starmix comes in at the tail end of this process, correct?
Correct. Once all the laboratory work has completed, which includes that what we call quote unquote bench work or wet work, where you're adding chemicals, doing the amplification, or running it on those instruments. It's after all of those pieces.
And as you testified, you worked directly with some of the mixtures in this case, and you reviewed the work that Sarah Miller did on some of the mixtures on this case as well, correct?
I did not perform any of the bench work or lab work in this case. I did review the data generated in 2018 as part of my technical review process of Mrs. Miller's work. And I did look at the DNA data developed and the report from Agent Strub back in 2012, again, as part of the preparation work for if new technology, new chemistry was going to be performed in 2018, 2019, and for preparation for court now.
And in 2018, as you know, another round of quantification was done for all of the mixtures you've been testifying about today, correct?
Correct. So the chemistry that targets the regions wasn't the only thing that's been updated since 2012. Also, that quantitation chemistry has been updated, if you will. There's a new version of it. And so the extracts went through this new quantitation procedure in 2018.
And I want to turn your attention to CBI 1.1, the sample, the mixture, you will. It's been subject to 3 different analyses, okay?
Yes, thank you.
And when 1.1 was run again, and would the people be kind enough to publish prosecution 341 so I can remind everyone what we're talking about? I'd be grateful. When permission to move about the courtroom?
Yes.
Safe to say, as you testified on direct, 1.1, this box right here, that's the text box, correct?
Yes.
And it points to that area there in the living room, correct?
Yes.
And a fresh set of quantification was done in 2008 that you reviewed?
2018.
2018. And do you remember what that quantification was for item 1.1?
I have made a note of it, if I may reference my notes.
By all means.
Thank you. The quantitation value for item 1.1 was approximately 1 nanogram per microliter. So nanogram is the amount of DNA. A microliter is a volume measure of DNA.
And when you say about, you're referring to the small autosomal, correct?
Correct. There are multiple targets in this quantitation test. the small autosomal is what is used for global filer amplification and analysis. It is the small human target, if you will.
Right. And then it actually came out at 0.99 and then several numbers, correct?
Correct. I rounded slightly.
Okay. And again, you said nanograms or is it picograms?
This value is nanograms per microliter.
Okay, so it's almost 1 nanogram.
Correct.
And how does that relate to a gram? How many nanograms in a gram?
I forget.
Fair enough. One of the things you do as an expert in these areas is you try and keep on top of your field. In fact, you help bring CBI into the era of Starmix, correct?
Yes, that's fair to say.
So you have to keep up on studies and data regarding DNA and touch DNA and all that stuff, correct?
I do make efforts to do that, yes.
And again, you've told the jury here when we're talking about item 1.1, it's almost 1 nanogram, correct?
Yes, this is, again, an estimation. And so it is estimated to be almost 1 nanogram of total human DNA per microliter, which is a very small unit of measure.
And you know from keeping on top of the science on this that a person can leave about 1 nanogram or even less DNA on a surface just by touching it with a fingerprint, correct?
I don't know if a fingerprint would leave a nanogram of DNA unless there was a biological fluid already on that finger. So a human cell, one single human cell, has about 16 picograms of DNA, so 0.016 nanograms. So if this is almost 1,000 picograms per microliter, I can't do that math off the top of my head, but one cell is 16 picograms.
And you've read in the Journal of Forensic Sciences about studies that have talked about touch DNA, correct?
Yes, I have read studies in that journal and in others about touch DNA.
And how even just touching an item can leave right about or even a little bit less than a nanogram of DNA material on something, correct?
I don't recall the quantities that had been transferred specifically. I just do recall that, yes, with any contact, there's a transfer of information. And also that amount differs between individual and with other factors, like did they wash their hands, did they touch their face, and other things.
Would looking at the Journal of Forensic Sciences, volume 58, number 2, March 2013, help refresh your recollection as to the amount of DNA that can be left behind on a surface by merely touching it?
Likely, yes.
Yes.
I'm going to turn your attention to Journal of Forensic Sciences, volume 58, number 2, March 23rd. Influence of swabbing solutions on DNA recovery from touch samples, page 465 and page 467. I think the information is on 467.
Thank you. This particular paragraph that has been brought to my attention on page 467 is in regards to quantifiler, which may have been the previous version of the quantitation kit that was used in 2018. And some of the samples, DNA yields range from 0 to 881 picogram per microliter. Did that answer your question?
And 881 picograms, how close is that to a nanogram?
That is also getting closer to 1,000 picograms, which is 1 nanogram.
And you rounded up 99 0.999 picograms up to 1 nanogram. Would you do the same with 881 picograms? If you're rounding to the nearest nanogram, that would be 1.
To the nearest nanogram, I would probably characterize it as almost 900.
Okay.
I try to be more precise, and thank you for pointing that out.
Okay. Refocusing on item 1.1, you know from reviewing Ms. Strub's report from 2012 that at the lab that tested negative for blood, correct?
Yes, when she performed serological examinations with phenolphthalein in the lab in 2012, she obtained a negative phenolphthalein result for item 1.1.
And you also know and you've testified that in 2012, Ms. Strub performed a DNA analysis using different systems, different programs than you did in 2018 and 2019, correct?
Correct. The systems that were online in 2012 were earlier generations, if you will. Kind of like, they don't update every year like your iPhone does, but they do update every several years or few years. And so this was an earlier quantitation chemistry and an earlier amplification chemistry called Identifiler Plus.
And that was being used pretty much in all investigations by CBI on these sorts of issues at that time, right? This wasn't some weird outlying ancient technology, correct?
Correct. That was the chemistry commonly used in casework at CBI laboratory as well as many others. There are different commercial kits, as we call them, that are available that target regions of DNA, and so Identifiler Plus is one of those.
And you know from your review that Rebecca Strub from CBI determined, when we're talking about item 1.1, and if I could have 341 back on the screen, that'd be great, that when talking about item 1.1, that part of the SOFA, her analysis in 2012 was Corey could not be excluded from that mixture, Dylan could not be excluded from that mixture, and Mr. Mark Redwine could not be excluded from that mixture, correct?
That is also my recollection from her report that I reviewed, that she assessed it to be a mixture of 3 contributors, and those 3 individuals could not be excluded given the interpretation and statistics that were in place at 2012.
And then as part of the ongoing scientific process, these mixtures were revisited by Ms. Miller in 2018, correct?
Yes, it was commonplace for us in 2018 after we finished that validation of Starmix for cases that we had any analyst, when I say we, that an analyst had an active subpoena for, but they had not yet testified. We looked at those cases to determine would Starmix benefit that case. Were there mixtures that were complex, perhaps related individuals? Would Starmix benefit that case, or were the previous results sufficient to potentially answer an investigative question?
And because Starmix was a new technology to Colorado Bureau of Investigation, it was subject to scrutiny on your behalf and CBI as well, correct?
Can you clarify the question?
It was subject to a validation study, correct?
Yes, it was subject to an internal validation study.
Internal validation study, meaning CBI wanted to look at this program and see if it was on point or help you in your investigations, correct?
Yes, that's fair. The internal validation is done whenever, for example, a new instrument is brought on or a new chemistry. So before we brought GlobalFiler online, it had to go through its own internal validation to determine what are those optimum ranges that I talked about, what are some of the limits of detection for the genetic analyzer and the data that comes off. So internal validation is a common thing that's done in the laboratory. Some are just bigger and with more pieces than others. Starmix was a very large internal validation for our system because we wanted to make sure that we tested it very well and also understood some of the limitations that could be associated with this software.
And boiling down Starmix into layperson terms with me here, I mean, what Starmix can do is it will analyze a mixture of DNA material, correct?
Yes.
And it'll, if necessary, or if you deem it's appropriate, look at that mixture and compare it to known DNA samples, correct?
Yes.
And then it will posit hypotheses or proportions of who, if anyone, from those known samples is contributing to that mixture, correct?
So Starmix does not propose propositions or hypotheses. That is what I, as the analyst, tell the software to test. As part of its breakdown of a mixed DNA profile into its probable combinations of genetic information, it will give a mixture proportion associated with that. So those were some of those percentages that I had spoken about on direct. And then the hypothesis testing comes from the scientist. I tell Starmix, hey, here is the sample, perhaps of 2 contributors. My hypothesis is, 1, that this person of interest is included. My second hypothesis is that they are not included. It is an unknown, unrelated individual. Starmix provides me a statistic to represent that hypothesis testing. That's that likelihood ratio. If your numerator is greater than your denominator, it gives support for the proposition that it's the person of interest being tested, that the evidence is however many times more likely to be observed if the person of interest is a contributor rather than your unknown, unrelated individual. That was your denominator. If your denominator is bigger, that gives support for that unknown, unrelated individual, not your person of interest. That gets reported as an exclusion. As I said, a number of people had been excluded from different profiles. And so that's what happens in that case, for that Starmix proposition.
And the scientist, the analyst, the first thing you do in the Starmix investigation process, forgive me, is you estimate the number of contributors in a specific mixture, correct?
Starmix does require that the analyst input a number of contributors for a sample. So the analyst will use their training and education and experience and our discipline operation manual. We have a process outlined for how to estimate or assign your number of contributors for a particular sample.
So what you do basically, and you've talked about this a little bit, is you look at the E-grams and you've told the jury about the peaks, right?
Yes, we look at the data.
Right. You look at the data, and the data is different locations on the DNA molecule, correct?
Yes.
And with Global Filer and Starmix, we're talking about 24 locations, 21 are in play, the other 3 are associated with Jen, right?
That is correct.
Right. And as you said, at each and every one of these locations on the molecule, you look and see how many peaks or alleles we call them, right?
Yes, that is, alleles is the term for a DNA peak. Yes, and so we count the number of peaks or alleles we see at a location.
And if you have a non-mix, like if you just look at my DNA off my forehead here, I'm going to have a peak from mom and a peak from dad at every location, except for the gen.
So if you get the same allele from your mom and your dad, you will only show 1 peak. If you get a different allele from mom and dad, you will show 2 peaks at that location. So by counting the number of alleles at a location and dividing by 2, that gives you your minimum number of contributors. So if there is 5 peaks, divided by 2 is 2.5. You can't have half a person. So you bump it up to 3. But that's not the only information we look at. We also examine the intensities of each of those peaks to determine, based on the different relative intensities, does the number of contributors need to be increased as well.
So as you did or as was done by Ms. Miller in this case, she looked at presumably several different locations on the E-gram, on the DNA molecule, counted the peaks, divided by 2, looked at the intensity of the peaks, and then she estimated the number of contributors to item 1.1, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And after that data gets entered, the number of contributors, it's then that Starmix posits what the proportions of what those different number of contributors could be, correct? The numbers come back first, right?
Yes, that is part of Starmix's breakdown of a DNA profile, if you will. It will break down each contributor position, so contributor 1, 2, 3, 4, if they are present. And once it has finished its analysis and given the analyst the options it has come up with for those breakdowns, it also provides that mixture proportion that it ultimately developed while it was interpreting that DNA profile.
And then Starmix can compare known profiles to those proportions and see if, I think as you described it, see if there's a fit there.
Yes. So I, as an analyst, would set up Starmix and say, here is my deconvolution, or in this case, item 1.1 as a 4-person mixture. Now compare it to each reference individually and then provide those results. So does that individual fit within this mixture, and at what contributor position do they best align with? And then if I have multiple individuals fitting, I do that combination fit test. Can they all coexist together?
And again, this process, going back to step 1, estimating the number of contributors, you never know the number of contributors, correct?
Correct. In an unknown casework sample, the true number of contributors is never known.
So you estimate that for Starmix analysis, correct?
Yes. With every profile being run within Starmix, the number of contributors needs to be assessed and assigned. If the number of contributors cannot be determined reliably, then it is reported as not suitable for comparisons and nothing further is done.
And you know from your training and expertise and CBI standard operating procedures that if you overestimate the number of contributors, you can falsely include non-contributors, correct?
Yes, this was tested in our validation piece. One of the components that needs to be tested for Starmix is what happens when you have a known mixture of 3. I know this because I made it in the laboratory for my validation. I say I, but another person made it. And then what happens when you add one person to that mixture and you have Starmix do its analysis and then compare it to a database of randomly generated DNA profiles? What happens is, as counsel mentioned, you increase the chance that you have an adventitious inclusion just because you may share some DNA with an unrelated person. This is because when you add a contributor, you're telling Starmix, you have all this genetic information, now you need to spread it out amongst 4 people, not just 3. So it gives more opportunities for individuals to fit where they, under a 3-person hypothesis, would not have, because it just didn't make sense. But by adding that ambiguity and that extra person, Starmix will allow for adventitious inclusion. So it's a true result by the software. They cannot be excluded. But because of the validation work, we know that they aren't actually present in that mixture. It's just because they happen to share some DNA by chance, which happens. That's not unique to Starmix.
Overestimate the number of contributors, get false inclusions. On the other side of the table, if you underestimate the number of contributors, you can falsely exclude real contributors as well, correct?
Yes, again, this happened in our validation that we were testing. So sometimes we generated, say, a 3-person mixture, but based on the observable data, it only appeared to be a 2-person mixture. Naturally, 3 people, especially unrelated people, cannot fit in a 2-person mixture. And so one of the known donors to that sample, usually the most minor component, is returned as an exclusion. And that's called, in the validation sense, a false exclusion, because we know that we put their DNA into that sample. However, like I said, if there's no detectable information for that contributor, you don't necessarily want to falsely call it a 3% in this example. You have to go on what's observable. But this allows you to understand, how does the software function? So if you have underestimated the number of contributors.
And I think I appreciate you arming the jury with all this information.
Sorry.
Unless there's an objection, I think you've answered the question as to whether or not. So overestimate false inclusions, underestimate false exclusions.
Yes, those are the very simplistic terms for what can happen.
Now, I'm trying to keep it simplistic here.
You are.
And you've talked about the validation study, and the fact is, in the validation study, CBI analysts estimated the wrong number of contributors 21 out of 188 times, correct?
I do need to correct part of that statement. So our internal validation was done in conjunction with the Institute of Environmental Science and Research, who are the developers of Starmix. The CBI generated our mixtures, our data, and we sent them to ESR basically for the data crunching piece. They could do it a lot faster. We had grant money and said, help us. I would argue also that the number of contributors weren't wrongly assigned. They were assigned based on an experienced analyst, again at ESR, who understands global filer chemistry, DNA, and PCR. And so they assigned the apparent number of contributors. So that was the testing that was performed. And yes, in 21 times, the apparent number of contributors differed from the experimental design. And oftentimes, that was because there was a lower amount of DNA or one or more contributors being put into that reaction, and so they were not detectable.
And as we know from the validation study and other investigations, sometimes the estimate's wrong, factually.
The assignment of the apparent number of contributors did differ for some samples to the experimental design.
Getting back to 1.1, the couch. As you said on direct, you reviewed and to a certain extent worked with Ms. Miller on that sample, correct?
Yes.
And you said something during direct that caught my attention. You said that you didn't see any contradictions between Ms. Strub's findings in 2012 and Ms. Miller's findings in 2018. You remember saying that?
I recall saying in the totality of testing from 2012 versus 2018 and 2019.
And I think you also said those results from 2012 versus 2018 were slightly different. You remember saying that before the break?
Your Honor, objection. I believe it's misstating the testimony from the witness. She gave a longer explanation in comparing and discussing 2012 to 2018 and 2019. I'll just ask counsel to be accurate.
I'm being...
She specifically said slightly, and then I think she explained it. So I think it's okay.
Safe to say, Strub said Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine could not be excluded from 1.1, correct?
Correct. Under an older...
Right. You've answered my question.
Okay.
No, she's allowed to explain as long as it doesn't go too far. She's told to tell the truth, or sworn to tell the whole truth. So go ahead and finish your answer.
Thank you. Yes, she did come to that conclusion, and I wanted to repeat that it is in an older statistical interpretation, which has been moved away from since then.
And that older statistical interpretation was the standard for CBI at that time in just about all, if not in just about all investigations like this, correct?
It was, as well as many other laboratories across the United States.
And then in 2018, Ms. Miller specifically reported Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine are excluded as potential contributors to this DNA profile, referring to 1.1, correct?
When tested as a three-person contributor, or yes, a three-person mixture, yes, they were excluded by the Starmix software program.
And it was Ms. Miller's analysis and work with Starmix, it was reviewed by you as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you would agree Straub excludes Corey and Dylan and Miller in 2018. Straub in 2012 includes Corey and Dylan, and Miller in 2018 excludes them.
Yes.
And in fact, when we look at the deconvolution and likelihood ratio that Miller came up with in 2018, Starmix estimated that Mr. Mark Redwine was contributing 76% of the material to that mixture, correct?
Yes, that is my recollection for the 3-person analysis. And when Mark Redwine was compared, he aligned with contributor number 1, who was estimated at 76% by the software program.
Then, as you testified on direct, CBI was asked to look at Starmix again in July 2019, right?
Correct. Just item 1.1.
And basically, the defense team for Mr. Redwine asked you to test 1.1 under different assumptions.
Yes.
And again, you and Ms. Miller are kind of the gatekeeper for those sorts of requests, right, as you testified on direct?
Yes, the technical leader and then assistant technical leader, whomever they may be, would, as counsel said, be the gatekeepers for that sort of request or alternative testing, if you will. We would assist the analyst, whomever the analyst was, in determining if this is an appropriate test to perform.
And after we asked you to retest 1.1, presuming the presence of Mr. Mark Redwine and presuming 4 contributors, CBI, you determined that was an appropriate request.
Yes, it was.
And you actually ran that because, as you'd explained on direct, Ms. Miller was a little bit out of the loop back then, so you ran that Starmix hypothesis or whatever you want to call it, correct?
Yes, she wasn't necessarily out of the loop. She would just be unavailable for trial. And so that's why I performed this analysis. And she was my technical reviewer because, again, she has familiarity with the case, and we discussed the requests that had come in.
So running 1.1, presuming that Mr. Mark Redwine's DNA is going to be in that mixture because he lives there, and presuming that there's 4 contributors, I want to talk about your results that you got in 2019, okay?
Okay.
And one of the results was the mixture was 620,000 times more likely if it was Mark Redwine, David Stone, and 2 others than Mark and some unrelated people, correct?
I may have missed the beginning of your statement, and forgive me. So assuming the presence of Mark, this mixture was at least, or is at least, as you stated, 620,000 times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark, David, and 2 unknowns rather than Mark and 3 unknowns.
And since you're better at reading your report than I am, what was the conclusion you came to as to Mr. Mark Redwine and Corey Redwine and 2 other contributors?
Assuming the presence of Mark Redwine, this mixture is at least 740 million times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark, Corey, and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals than if it originated from Mark and 3 unknown, unrelated individuals.
And I'm going to ask you to look at that 740 number one more time. I don't think it's million. I think it's 740,000.
I have 6 zeros following 740, so 740 million.
I apologize.
No problem.
Conclusions as to Mark and Dylan and 2 unrelated versus Mark and 3 unrelated.
For that analysis, assuming the presence of Mark, this mixture is at least 840,000 times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark, Dylan, and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals than if it originated from Mark and 3 unknown, unrelated individuals.
And the conclusions you came to regarding if it's Mark, Corey, and Dylan and an unrelated contributor versus Mr. Mark Redwine and 3 unrelated contributors.
Yes. Assuming the presence of Mark Redwine, this mixture is at least 1.3 million times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark Redwine, Corey Redwine, Dylan Redwine, and an unknown, unrelated individual than if it originated from Mark Redwine and 3 unknown, unrelated individuals.
And as Starmix does, and as you testified to a lot the last couple of days, Starmix will run this information through its program and give you back percentages or estimated percentages of contributions, right?
Correct. When Starmix performs its initial deconvolution, as I've labeled it, or as it is called, it will give you the approximate mixture proportions that it has estimated for each contributor.
And then the next step in the process is it can see which known contributors are associated with those proportions, right?
Yes, as the analyst is testing those people of interest, Starmix will determine where they best fit and provide a likelihood ratio, whether it's in support of the hypothesis of the evidence is more likely to be observed if they're a contributor, or gives the number for if it's more likely to be observed if it's an unknown, unrelated individual. So that's an exclusionary value.
And I'm going to ask you to come back with me to layperson talk here.
Okay.
Because we're dealing with two different, and I'm going to ask you to stick with me. We're dealing with 2 different families of numbers here. One is the chances of certain contributors being in this mix compared to unknown individuals. That's where we get these insanely big numbers, right?
You can. Likelihood ratios range from 0 to infinity.
Right. And then we have this other family of numbers about percentage of contribution amongst known contributors, correct?
Correct. That's what we've been talking about as those mixture proportions.
And to build on something that Mr. Doherty said, suppose you got a bucket of motor oil and chocolate milk. With me?
Yes.
And in another world with another Starmix machine, you run Starmix on a sample from that bucket, and you come to the conclusion that the chances of this being motor oil and chocolate milk is 32 trillion times more likely than it being any 2 other liquids.
Okay, I'm with you.
You with me? Does
Yes.
that sound like something Starmix could do if we were doing this sort of testing for?
It does. The statement you would use for the likelihood ratio is that this combination of fluids is however many times more likely to be observed if it's milk and motor oil rather than 2 unknown fluids.
And that's a different analysis than something else Starmix does, which can say, based upon the program, it believes that the bucket is 70% motor oil and 30% milk, right?
Correct. Those are different. The mixture proportions are a different breakdown of Starmix. The likelihood ratio is the weight of the evidence with the person of interest being tested. So they're just different things.
And when we look at item 1.1, presuming the presence of Mr. Mark Redwine, presuming the presence of 4 contributors, the deconvolution report for that final analysis came back with specific numbers, specific estimates, percentages, you will, of contribution for 4 contributors, correct?
Yes.
And those contributions were respectively contributor number 1, 69, contributor number 2, 26, contributor number 3, 3, and contributor number 4, 1%, correct?
Correct.
And on that final analysis, for presuming Mr. Mark Redwine present, testing for Corey and Dylan and an unknown, Mr. Mark Redwine's associated with the 69%, correct?
Yes. Mr. Mark Redwine is locked in as contributor 1, being that assumed individual. And contributor 1 was estimated at approximately 69%, as counsel stated.
And contributor 2 is associated with Mr. Corey Redwine, correct?
Correct.
And contributor 3 is an unknown based on the likelihood from the previous report, correct?
Correct, because one of the individuals in the numerator, so the numerator testing is we're assuming Mark, we're asking if Corey, Dylan, plus an unknown. So the unknown had to fall somewhere in that contributor list. So the unknown fell into the contributor 3 spot.
And it's Dylan Redwine who Starmix associates with contributor number 4 at 1%.
Correct.
And again, to revisit here, when we're talking about this sample, we're talking about a little bit less than a nanogram of material, correct?
Yes, a little bit less than a nanogram per microliter.
You also testified about the other mixtures that you reviewed that Ms. Miller did in 2018. Remember talking about that?
Yes.
I'd turn your attention to CBI 3.1, and I'm going to again ask the prosecution to publish 341 for the jury, please. Permission to move to the screen, Judge?
Yes.
And safe to say, the text box that's helping us get through this is right in the middle of 341. You see where I'm pointing to it?
Correct, yes.
And that's associated with, here's a piece of the floor within Mr. Redwine's living room, correct?
Yes.
And you testified on direct what the deconvolution percentages report was for the percentage of contributors for Starmix. You recall what that was for item 3.1, this part of the floor, which is DNA stuff.
Yes, I do, and I can repeat them. So this was a mixture indicative of 2 contributors. When Starmix performed its deconvolution and provided the mixture proportions, it estimated contributor 1 at approximately 54% and contributor 2 at 46%.
And 54 was associated with Mr. Corey Redwine, correct?
Yes, when Corey Redwine was compared to the mixture, he best aligned in the contributor number 1 position, which was 54%.
And Dylan Redwine was associated with the 46%, correct?
Yes, again, Dylan best corresponded to the second contributor spot at 46%, as counsel said.
And on direct, you said those are, you used something to the effect of those are basically equivalent or something like that. Is that what you said?
They are roughly half and half. There is some difference there. I do recall saying that, you know, when I looked at the electropherogram as a technical reviewer, I said, okay, they are approximately equal, and Starmix gave out a 54-46%, which I agreed with.
Right. Approximately equal, about as equal as 54 and 46 can be.
Sure.
Turning your attention to item number 5, I'm going to ask that to stay up and for about the next 341 through the next 5-10 minutes, counsel. Thank you. To orient everyone, safe to say item 5 is the bottom text box here?
Yes.
Okay. And again, that's referring to an area on the floor in the living room?
Yes.
And again, the deconvolution report for item 5 returned a summary of contributors and percentages. Could you recite those to the jury?
I don't have that deconvolution report, but I do have notes that contributor 1 was estimated.
You know what? If you don't have, I'm sorry for interrupting, Dex, but I got a copy of the deconvolution report.
That would be lovely because I'm missing contributor 3. Thank you, sir. Contributor 1 was estimated at 63%, contributor 2 at 36%, and I'm relieved I could do math earlier. Contributor 3 is 1%.
And you said those kind of fast, not to cumulative. Can you say that one more time?
Yes. Contributor 1, estimated 63%. Contributor 2, estimated 36%. Contributor 3, estimated 1%.
And who did Starmix associate with those numbers? And if you could say the number with the person, it was with the known sample it was associated.
When both Mark Redwine and Dylan Redwine were individually tested, they both best aligned with contributor 1 at the 63% contribution. Corey Redwine best aligned with the contributor 2 spot, which was a 36% contribution.
You would agree, though, that when running for all three, that Dylan Redwine associates with contributor number 2 to draw your attention to LR from previous reports.
I don't, thank you. So this LR from previous report, this is the report that Starmix gives when you test a person of interest against your deconvolution. This is the total fit test, I guess you could say. This is when all three individuals, Mark, Corey, and Dylan, are being tested to see if they can coexist in the mixture together and explain the data. When this test is performed, Corey aligns in contributor 1.
And what percentage is that?
Thank you, at 63%. Dylan aligns with contributor 2, 36%, and Mark Redwine is being put in contributor 3, which is the 1%. Again, these are the best fits for this combination of people being tested, and this resulted in a likelihood ratio of 0, which was an exclusion. And that corresponds to that statement where, although there is individual support, though there is moderate support for the individual inclusion of Mark Redwine to the mixture DNA profile, all three of these individuals cannot be in the mixture together.
So it can be one or two of them, but not all three of them.
The only combination tests that were performed on this item were Mark, Corey, and Dylan, which resulted in a does not fit result. And then Corey and Dylan were tested together, which resulted in the result that you see in this exhibit.
Well, the exhibit doesn't have the percentages, I don't think.
It does not. It does not. What was not tested, for example, is Corey and Mark and Dylan and Mark. Those tests were not performed.
And those weren't performed because you didn't run them, correct?
Correct.
Or Ms. Miller didn't run them, I'm sorry.
They are not routinely run at CBI. That's just something that is not usually tested. However, if that had been requested, we would have run those tests.
Turning your attention to item 6.1, like this. That's item. Oh, that. Second to the top text box, correct?
Yes.
And that looks like it's referring to another part of the sofa there in the right-hand corner. Actually, my bad. That's the coffee table corner, correct?
Yes, their description is the swabs of the coffee table.
Okay. And again, there was a deconvolution report which broke out percentages, estimated percentages of contributions to the mixture, correct?
Yes.
And what were those percentages for contributor 1 and contributor 2?
This is a two-person mixture. So Starmix had 2 contributors to break down and assign a mixture proportion to. Contributor 1 was estimated at 84% contribution, and contributor 2 was estimated at 16%.
And who did Starmix associate with 1 and 2 respectively? You could say those percentages.
CBI aligned Mark Redwine when he was tested as contributor 1 at 84%. And then Dylan aligned with contributor 2 at 16% when he was tested to this profile.
And from your work on this case, you're also familiar with the fact that item 5, Ms. Straub determined came back negative for blood in her serology test, right?
Yes, her screening results did not indicate the presence of blood.
Okay. So Straub's conclusions as to blood negative on items 1 and 5, correct?
Yes, to the best of my recollection.
Nothing further for this witness.
Redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Ma'am, I only have a few questions for you. I'm going to pick up where counsel left off, talking about tests that are run to determine whether something is presumptively positive blood. Those tests are using a liquid, is that right?
Yes, it is a chemical in liquid form that is applied to the sample being tested, or a small scraping or selection of that, if you will.
Fair to say that can have the effect of diluting a substance down further with each test that's conducted?
Typically, when phenolphthalein is performed, you are taking a very small sample of what is of interest to directly perform that test on, and then you recollect from where you sampled to then do your downstream DNA analysis. Luminol and Blue Star, these in the field chemical tests, you are spraying reagents on an area. And so by applying this fluid, yes, you can dilute down your sample.
What's the sensitivity ratio, if you know, for phenolphthalein?
From CBI's internal validation of phenolphthalein in 2012, it was estimated that the sensitivity was approximately 1 in 10,000. So 1 part blood to 10,000 parts water, non-blood, would indicate a positive result for that test.
That's the sensitivity ratio for hematry.
Again, from the 2012 internal validation of Hemotrace, that sensitivity limit of detection within CBI was determined to be at approximately 1 to 50,000. So 1 part blood, 50,000 parts non-blood.
So based on those numbers, as well as what you testified to earlier, Hemotrace provides a higher level of, you could fill in the blank, confidence about a likely or presumptively positive test result.
Based on CBI's internal validations in 2012 on both of those tests, Hemotrace was found to be more sensitive than phenolphthalein.
Possible false positives for higher primates.
Correct. The higher primates and ferrets.
And ferrets, yes. And you're aware from your work on this case, follow up with what counsel was just asking about, that Joe Clayton tested various areas with phenolphthalein, and where indicated with the Abacar brand Hemotrace for the indication of human blood.
I did read in his report that he used phenolphthalein and Hemotrace at the scene, at the residence, I should say. Right, there are multiple scenes, if you will. But I don't have direct knowledge of what testing he applied to each individual surface per area, because I wasn't there.
And that several areas did reveal positive results.
Yes.
And that would include 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 at the crimes.
I don't have direct
Form of the question, crime scene.
In the living room.
1, 2, 3, 5, 6 in the defendant's living room, presumptively positive for blood, although acknowledging possibility of higher primates generating false positives.
I don't have direct knowledge if Hemotrace was done on all of these, But I do know that if a phenolphthalein and or hemotrace was positive, it would have been collected to then submit to the CBI laboratory. So I can agree that these samples indicated the presence of blood, but I don't know the specific tests that were applied to each individual sample.
You're aware Joe Clayton's testified earlier in this trial?
Yes.
Moving on, do you recall which truck bed you observed stains in that you then swabbed, or excuse me, then applied phenolphthalein to?
I'm going to reference back to the crime scene notes, if I may, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Thank
To
you.
refresh your recollection, to look at I have the crime scene notes here if you like, or if you have them there.
I have a copy from the FBI agent.
Perfect.
Thank you. It appears that from these notes, there were stains in the truck bed of the Chevrolet pickup, which did not indicate the presence of blood. For the Dodge pickup, it only notes the interior seats that we talked about. So it doesn't say if there were truck bed swabs on the Dodge.
Thank you. The article that counsel showed you from the Journal of Forensic Science, is that a 2013 article?
It was either 2013 or 2015. I can't recall.
Fair to say the technology's changed a lot since then?
Probably, yes.
When you talked about Starmix, is CBI the only laboratory that uses Starmix?
No, there are many laboratories across the United States. From what I last know, over 46 or 47 laboratories have performed their internal validation of Starmix to use in casework, and there's over 20 that are in the current process of their internal validation.
Switching gears on you, when we talk about mixtures and how you assign a minimum or at least number of contributors to a mixture, what is the protocol for CBI? Is it a more conservative number, a higher number? How do you approach that?
CBI, to assess the number of contributors, follows the guidelines that are published by the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods, or SWGDAM, SWGDAM. This procedure that they suggest and outline, so this is it's a guideline, it's not a you must, but we like to align ourselves with SWGDAM when possible, is to do that maximum allele count that we talked about and then divide by 2, as well as take into account your differing peak height intensities to determine if you should add another contributor based on your number of peaks assessment. Many other laboratories, actually all forensic labs that I am aware of, use this kind of basic approach to assess the number of contributors and assign it. There are some software systems that people are working on validating that will indicate your number of contributors for you, but to my knowledge, none of them have finished their validation and are being used in casework, and that's only in a couple laboratories. I've heard of this at my continuing education conferences that I talked about.
And Mr. Bogan used my oil and chocolate milk analogy, and I'm just going to wrap up our questions and go back to that, okay?
Okay.
Let's say I have 5 buckets here, oil and chocolate milk, 5 different amounts. CBI is producing 2 different types of results. One is whether there's support for the proposition that there's oil and chocolate milk in the pot. Is that right?
Yes, if oil and chocolate milk are being compared to people of interest, person one, person two. Yes, Starmix is saying, I have my deconvolution, I have two fluids in here. If the fluids are chocolate milk and oil, what is the probability of observing the evidence if it is these two fluids rather than some other two fluids?
That's where we get the high numbers, the 490 parts.
That's where you can get those high numbers because, as I said, the likelihood ratio can range from 0, which is exclusion, to infinity. We don't know how high those numbers can go.
Depending on the results of the analysis, could be anywhere from 0 to 490 per decillion or to infinity.
Yes, I have seen on, for example, my internal competency test to use Starmix, we had a value was 85 or 86 zeros after it, and we had to Google what that number was.
Then for the percentages, Starmix is trying to calculate what percentage of DNA belongs to each individual within that.
Yes, as part of Starmix's deconvolution report, when it's trying to break down that DNA profile into its most probable combinations of different individuals, it not only provides what that genetic information is probably for that contributor, it also gives that mixture proportion estimate. So this is how much, based on Starmix's modeling, this contributor is estimated to be contributing to this overall DNA profile. And that takes into account the peak heights that are observed, so the intensities of that DNA allele, both within one location and across the entire profile, degradation effects, and template. It does a lot of analysis that, again, a human could do. It's been demonstrated via calculations by hand. It just takes a really long time. And so that's why probabilistic genotyping, like Starmix, is such a powerful tool.
We'll take out number 2, because number 2 is a sole source of DNA. For 1, 3, 5, and 6, is it fair to say that the analysis conducted provides very strong support for the proposition that Dylan Redwine is a contributor to each one of those mixtures when compared to other people in the manner you just described?
Compound question. It's 4 different, and it's cumulative, and it's been spoken of ad nauseum.
Overruled.
I can't quite answer the question as asked. Could you rephrase that?
Sure. You know what? I think does the exhibit capture the results you've discussed at length here today?
The exhibit does capture some of the combination fit test, if you will. Can multiple individuals coexist in each of these samples? Most of these results, well, actually 3 of them are from Mrs. Miller's report, 1 is from Becky Strub's report, and 1 is from my report testing item 1.1 as a 4-person mixture.
Counsel asked you about degradation. Did you have an opportunity to go back and look at, for example, item 2 to see if there was degradation of the sample or whether, in fact, there was a robust DNA sample from that location?
Foundation as to this topic.
Overruled.
We mentioned earlier about the current quantitation chemistry that has a small autosomal target. That's the total human I'm looking at. I believe I didn't get a chance to tell you that there's also a large autosomal target. So that is also human DNA. And if the large autosomal, it's a larger fragment, if that one is not quantified as efficiently as your smaller target, that can indicate that your sample has degradation. So you're getting the small pieces of DNA, those are still there, but your larger pieces have started to degrade and break up. The quant chemistry in place for item 2 back in 2012 did not have that capability. So I couldn't use the quantitation value to determine that. But I did look at the identifier plus data generated, and I can say that it is a fairly robust DNA profile. It doesn't appear to have degradation effects present.
I have nothing further. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Any questions from the jury? Okay, can this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor, please.
Thank you.
By all means.
Okay, you're free to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan.
Your next witness?
Thank you, Your Honor. The people call Roy Vreeland.
All right. Mr. Vreeland, if you'd raise your right hand before you sit down. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Have a seat.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
Could you please start by introducing yourself to the jury by your full name?
My name is Roy Vreeland, that's with a V,
And could you spell your last name for the court reporter, please?
Vreeland.
So, Mr. Vreeland, are you currently employed?
I retired 3 months ago.
Prior to your retirement 3 months ago, where did you work?
I was a deputy chief for Upper Pine River Fire Protection District, which is in Bayfield, Colorado.
How long did you work there?
26 years, 25 years, excuse me.
Can you just briefly walk the jury through your work history?
I started out years ago in the fire service as a volunteer, like many do. And then at Upper Pine, we were all volunteer department, no paid employees. In 2006, we transitioned to a combination department. And that's when I was hired. And I worked my way up through the ranks.
In your work in the fire department, did you also work on search and rescue?
Yes, I joined La Plata County Search and Rescue at the around 1996, again as a volunteer.
Did you have any prior experience with search and rescue before that?
Yes, I was involved in search and rescue teams since early 70s, different parts of the country.
Are you familiar with the area by Bayacito and Middle Mountain Road?
Very much so.
Why are you familiar there?
That's part of our fire district, and it's a very popular, Middle Mountain's a Fire Service road, and it's a very popular road in the summertime with hikers, hunters, quads, you name it.
Do you do trainings up there for search and rescue?
Yes, we do.
And then also, have you done searches up there for search and rescue?
Numerous searches over my 25 years with search and rescue.
I'd like to, and what types of duties does search and rescue duty entail?
What kind of duties?
Yes.
My duties?
Yes.
Again, so my duties are various. Early on, when I first started with them, I was basically what we call a ground pounder. We'd search for folks lost in the woods. Over the years, I trained in backcountry rescue, winter rescue, high alpine rescue, dog work, various different roles, including incident command.
Is dog work using canines to try to trail and locate people?
Yes.
And then over time, did you become someone who would be put on something like incident command?
Yes.
What does that mean?
You're just in charge, making assignments.
Let me turn your attention back to November 19th of 2012. what were you doing that day?
I was off work that day, down day. I don't remember specifically what I was doing during the day, but we got a page out in the evening of the 19th, and I immediately responded.
Do you recall roughly what time in the evening that was?
It was early evening. I don't remember the exact time of the page.
Was it around the time where it was starting to get dark but still light out?
Yes.
That sound about right?
Correct.
Do you recall roughly what the temperature was on that day?
Yes. The initial page came out of a missing child, and I grabbed my to-go bag and headed out the door, and I remember glancing at the thermometer because that was a concern, especially in mid to late November, and it was in the low 40s.
Why does that concern you at that time of year?
I'm looking at survivability aspects of a 12-year-old person lost in the mountains.
13-year-old, does that sound right? I'll get to that in a second, but you're talking about a child missing,
yes.
Something that you're
the reports of a child missing.
What kind of coat did you have that day? Do you recall?
A down jacket.
So where were you called out to?
County Road 500. I don't remember the specific address.
Does 2343 sound right?
Correct.
Is that an area that you're very familiar with?
Yes.
I'm going to, at this time, show you, Mr. Vreeland, the previously admitted exhibit, 22. And then it's going to come up on your screen. Sir, do you recall this area? Do you know this area well?
I know it quite well.
And you referenced County Road 500. Can I approach Your Honor with the pointer?
Yes.
So, Mr. Vreeland, you can feel free to approach the screen.
Mr. Vreeland, if you're talking, though, we're going to make you talk into the microphone next to you. So if you want to pull, if you want to pull it out, you can hold it.
Okay. So County Road 500 begins right here off the apex of County Road 501. And it goes up and it is campground trailhead.
Okay. Is that an area that is pretty high in altitude, higher than town?
Yes.
About 7,800 feet, sound about right?
That's approximately correct, yes.
Does that impact your concerns when someone's missing?
Well, it's colder temperatures in the mountains at night.
And I'm not sure I asked this question, but you alluded to it. What was specifically the call-out information that you received that night?
It's real basic. It's respond to the area, the address, that's 2300 block, County Road 500, for a missing male. I believe they stated the age, 12 or 13.
And they would note it's a juvenile, et cetera?
Yes.
I'm going to move to People's Exhibit 23, which previously admitted as well. So did you, in fact, respond up here to County Road 500?
I did.
Okay. And can you indicate for the jury where you came to, where that address is on the map?
Mr. Vreeland, if you stand in front, I know they can see, but off to the side, you can move that stand if you need to.
Okay, sorry. So I responded to this area right here.
Okay. And so if you could take a seat, Mr. Vreeland. Thank you for pointing that out. I'd like to, given your familiarity, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about this area in general. What is the terrain like surrounding this road?
It's a very rugged terrain up there. The area to the east of where Mark Redwine residence is basically just a sheer cliff band running up, and then it continues up the trailhead to Vicedo Creek, and it's very rugged terrain.
And are you referencing the cliff band? Is that between County Road 500 and the road to the right, the east?
County Road 500 behind the Redwine residence, which is basically the west, is where the clip band is.
I see. And then how about to the east of the residence?
To the east,
What's the terrain like?
County Road 500, directly to the east of that is interspersed with residential properties and the Vallecito Creek.
And then when you get past those residential properties in the Vallecito Creek, what does the terrain do then?
And it gradually goes up where the other road is. That's Middle Mountain Road, and that's very, very rugged terrain up there.
Is it wooded?
Very much so.
Are there cliffs in there as well?
Yes.
Is Middle Mountain Road the rightmost road to the east of the Redwine residence on the map? Yes, please, if you could point to it for the jury.
This is Middle Mountain Road. It's the Forest Service, starts down here off the
No, I mean, I can, but other people can't.
Yeah. Yeah, excuse me. So this is Middle Mountain Road, starts down here off the County Road 501, runs all the way up to what we call Tuckerville, the mining area, where there's a gate up there, that's about 2 miles.
What is that road like, sir?
It's a typical Forest Service road, meaning it's a gravel-based road. It's well maintained, closed in the winter. Holiday weekend. Gravel road, very, very windy.
Thank you. You can take a seat again, sir. So you mentioned the holiday season when it opens. Which holiday is that?
So typically, Labor Day weekend and Memorial weekend is opening and closing for that road. It can vary.
Okay. Does the road sometimes stay open through November, basically?
Not that I'm aware of. It's typically always been closed by then.
Is the road maintained in the wintertime?
No, it's used, it's not maintained, but it's used by snowmobilers, so snowmobilers keep it packed down fairly well.
And the gate's locked during that period of time in the winter when the snow's there?
Repeat that. I have a hearing deficit, so.
The gate's locked in the wintertime?
Correct.
When it's not maintained?
Correct.
And then is it the Forest Service? Someone from the Forest Service would know the dates of when it opens and closes, basically, for the season?
Yes.
Now, when you're looking at Middle Mountain Road, to the right of it on the picture or to the east of it on the map, is that a big mountain right there?
That's a huge mountain.
What mountain is that?
I'm not sure the actual name of that.
Okay. And then you talked about County Road 500. Is this an area that is busier in the summer than the winter? Is that fair to say?
And most definitely because of the trailhead at there's a campground at the trailhead up there.
Okay, and that campground, is that at the top of County Road 500?
Correct.
After that dead end, that's the end of the road?
The end of the road, and then the campground, and then a trail.
Okay. So is there a lot of traffic coming through there, or is it pretty desolate come November?
As far as car traffic?
Yes.
It's quite busy in the summertime.
Is there also a trail at the campsite?
Yes, there is.
Where does that trail go?
That goes back into the wilderness area.
And when you say the wilderness area, directionally, is that north?
Yes, that's north.
Does that trail go up and connect to Middle Mountain to your knowledge, or does it just head kind of north up into that more of a valley?
No, it's a very steep valley up there. So once you're on the Vallecito trailhead, it's very difficult to get to the other side. And there's no trails up there, just canyons.
I want to turn your attention back to November 19th of 2012. When you in fact responded to that residence, who else responded to that residence?
Deputy Potoff with the La Plata County Sheriff's Office and myself arrived basically at the same time. We parked beside each other.
Is that typical? Is it typical to have someone from the sheriff's office and someone from search and rescue both respond in this type of scenario?
Yes.
And since you responded around the same time, is this again going to be those evening hours, not quite dark, but getting there? And then when you responded there, what did you do?
Myself and the officer, we basically both got out of the car at the same time. We had a brief conversation. He said he would take the lead as far as asking questions, and I would look for a sent article.
Okay. And then, did you in fact contact the homeowner?
Yes.
What was the homeowner's name?
Mark Redwine.
Had you ever met him before?
No, sir.
And how quickly did he answer the door for you?
Immediately.
What, if anything, did you notice about his appearance?
I don't know the exact word, but rough, you know.
Can you just explain what you mean by rough?
Disheveled, just rough looking.
Did you previously note that he looked like maybe he had a rough night kind of look to him?
Yeah, that's it.
Tired and unkempt?
Correct.
Don't lead any further question.
Yes, Your Honor. Did you notice anything lying around inside or outside of the house that you observed in a search and rescue context that was notable?
Numerous empty liquor bottles,
What was his
inside and outside.
What was his demeanor like when you contacted him?
Just laid back, nonchalant.
Was there any emotion?
No, sir.
Did he seem concerned?
I think he can testify as to what his observations were of Mr. Redwine's emotional state, so it's fine.
So let me back up one step too, Mr. Vreeland. You've contacted a lot of families in the search and rescue context?
I'm just to repeat.
Have you contacted a lot of families in the search and rescue context?
Hundreds.
Okay.
Over my career, hundreds.
What kind of demeanor do you typically observe from people in this context?
Typically, more people are showing a lot of emotion when somebody's missing, hysterical to the point that we might have to have a family member help intervene.
Was there anything unusual about Mr. Redwine's demeanor when you contacted him on November 19th of 2012?
Oh, like I said, he was
Objection, if I may, foundation, having not met Mr. Redwine before that, something this witness can't answer. It's something this witness can't answer.
I believe he can. You can cross-examine to go to weight, but he can testify as to what he observed compared to other people. Go ahead.
What was unusual about Mr. Redwine's demeanor?
There was a lack of emotional response, just like I said, laid back.
Okay. Did you talk to him? Did he seem frantic? Did he seem concerned about his child?
Objection, leading, this has been covered, asked and answered.
You can answer the question.
Just repeat the question, please.
Did he seem frantic and concerned and worried about his child?
I would say he was concerned, but because he was, but he was not frantic at all.
Did you ask him for a kind of a general explanation about Dylan so that you could try to conduct a search?
So, Officer Potoff asked the questions, and just the normal questions: name, age, and a brief description of what he was wearing.
Were you concerned whether he had left anything behind that could help?
So I was looking for a scent article, and as the two of those, as Potoff and Mr. Redwine were speaking, I was standing there, but I was looking around the kitchen and the living room area, looking for something for a scent article, so I could start my work right away.
Okay.
Time was of the essence.
What did Mr. Redwine say, if anything, about items left behind?
He said there was nothing there.
What did he say about a cell phone, if anything?
I don't recall. I did ask about maybe a cell phone charger, and he said there was nothing there there was nothing there that belonged to the boy.
Did you talk to him, did he mention something about fishing?
He told me that one of his son's favorite things to do was go fishing.
Did he talk about whether there was a fishing pole missing or not?
I believe the fishing pole came up at a later date.
Okay. Had he told you that he thought his son might have gone fishing?
Yes, he did.
And where did he tell you were some areas his son might have gone fishing?
So he said his favorite spot was down by the dam, which is quite a ways away, but he also fished in the stream that was across the street from them.
How far away was the dam?
It's around 9 miles to the south.
Did you ask Mr. Redwine how he would have gotten to the dam?
I did not ask that question.
Was he asked that question in your presence, how he would have gotten to the dam?
I don't believe that was, I don't recall.
Did you ask him about what clothing Dylan Redwine was wearing?
That question was asked. The thing that I remember the most is that he said he did not have a jacket.
Was that concerning to you?
Very much so with the temperatures.
Did that make sense given the daytime temperatures in terms of fishing?
Well, for daytime fishing, yeah, everybody's different with their tolerances for temperature, and with our intense sun up here, it could be quite doable during the daytime.
And then how about this time that you're arriving now? Getting close to dusk, is that about what time it was?
Correct, and getting quite chilly.
Did you have different concerns at that point in time about him not having a coat?
Absolutely.
What were your concerns?
Well, I was supposed to go to freezing or below freezing that night.
So you talked about that you looked around the house for anything that belonged to a child to use for a scent article, and then you talked to the defendant. Did you have a discussion about what types of items or articles you could use for scent trailing?
Yeah, I told him I was looking for anything up to and including, something that most people wouldn't even consider like chapstick, article of clothing, a hairbrush, a comb, a toothbrush, chapstick. And he said there was nothing in the house that belonged to the child.
How did he have a certain demeanor as you were asking him these questions?
Maybe a little annoyed, because I'm persistent for a scent article, because like I said, I need to get going and start looking.
Sure. Did you find that unusual that you couldn't get a single scent article, even some of those items that you described?
Yeah, because even if it's something old, I didn't know the history of the family. If something that was there from a year ago would have worked.
Did you finally ask the defendant where Dylan Redwine had slept?
Correct. I asked specifically where he slept that night, and he basically pointed over there, which was pointing to the sofa in the living room.
Okay. And when you looked over at the sofa, what did you see?
Some linens, including a pillow in a pillowcase, and that's when I asked Mark if I could take the pillowcase, and he said yes.
Then how did you do that?
I walked out to my car, grabbed a Ziploc bag, along with a set of nitrile gloves, came back inside, and took the pillowcase off the pillow and placed it in the Ziploc bag.
Okay. And when you collected that item, what did you intend to do with it?
I use that as a scent article for a dog.
Generally speaking, if someone sleeps on a pillowcase, does that make a good scent article for a dog?
Excellent article.
And you had a dog that you were going to try to search with that night to trail for Dylan's scent?
Correct.
So after you collected that item the way that you described, you said you used gloves in a bag, things like that. Then what did you do with that scent item?
So I basically told the officer that I was gonna start my search, and he was good with that. So I went outside. My dog was in the car. I got my dog, put her on lead, and then did what we call put her on scent. I opened the bag up and let her. She'll actually go over and just take a big inhalation and catch the scent.
She's probably a good place to stop. I would get into this somewhat extensively, I would think, with this witness. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, remember my admonitions. You're not to talk to anybody about the case. Don't let anybody talk to you about the case. Don't gather any information on your own. Don't do any reading or any searching on the internet. And we'll take an hour and 15 minutes. It's just almost noon now, so we will start up again at 1:15. So, everybody rise for the jury? Make sure you're back and ready to go by 1:10. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Let me have those out of there, Michael.